The summer of 1863 was heavy with heat and with destiny. The fields of the South lay in ruin. The rivers ran dark with blood, yet the Confederacy still stood defiant. Its heart beat in the chest of one man, General Robert E. Lee. For 2 years he had defied the odds, outnumbered, outgunned, yet never outmaneuvered. Now Lee believed the time had come for one final, decisive blow, not in Virginia's wasted soil, but on the green hills of the North. He would march his army into Union territory, and there, in one terrible clash, decide the fate of America. Stay with us and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss this turning point in our journey through the American Civil War. By June, the Army of Northern Virginia, 75,000 strong, crossed the Potomac River under burning skies. They sang as they marched, barefoot and hungry, through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, rich farmland untouched by war. To the weary men of the South, it felt like another world. They passed orchards bursting with fruit, barns filled with grain. For once, they were far from the desolation of home. "We are going to whip the Yankees on their own ground," one soldier wrote. "Then this war will be over." Lee's reasons were more complex. He knew his nation could not survive a war of attrition. The Confederacy needed a victory so bold, so undeniable, that it would force the North to the peace table. And perhaps, just perhaps, Europe, watching closely assured, would recognize the South as a nation at last. Yet fate, as always, would have its own plans. In late June, Union scouts lost track of Lee's army in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. Panic flickered in Washington. Lincoln, weary but watchful, appointed a new commander to lead the Army of the Potomac, Major General George Gordon Meade. Quiet, disciplined, and cautious, Meade had barely 3 days to prepare before Lee's army loomed across the countryside. Neither commander intended to fight at Gettysburg. But on July the 1st, 1863, Confederate soldiers searching for shoes stumbled upon Union cavalry west of town. A skirmish broke out, small, sharp, and unexpected. Within hours, both armies were converging. What began as a chance encounter would become the greatest battle ever fought on American soil. Sometimes history does not announce its arrival. It begins with a single shot, and the world changes forever. By midday, the hills around Gettysburg trembled under the weight of tens of thousands of men. Confederate divisions under Generals Heth and Ewell pressed hard against the Union lines. The air thickened with smoke and the bitter scent of gunpowder. Union troops under General John Buford fought from fence to fence, holding the high ground long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But by afternoon, the weight of Lee's army was too great. The Union line broke and fell back through the streets of Gettysburg. Civilians cowered in basements as the tide of war surged through their quiet town. When the day ended, the Union army had retreated to a ridge south of town, Cemetery Hill, a natural fortress. Lee, confident from a string of victories, believed he could finish them the next day. Night fell over a field of moans and prayers. Between the lines, the wounded cried out for water. The stars shone coldly over the dead. Lee slept believing that one more push would break the Union for good. Meade thought otherwise. His army was battered, but alive, and it held the high ground. At dawn on July the 2nd, the sun rose on the second day of battle, and on hell itself. Lee ordered simultaneous attacks on both Union flanks. To the south, his most trusted corps commander, James Longstreet, led the assault. Their target, 2 rocky hills, Little Round Top and Big Round Top, guarding the Union's left flank. The fight that followed was pure chaos. Union and Confederate lines clashed through wheat fields, peach orchards, and tangled woods. Cannon roared across the valley, turning earth and air into fire. The wheat field alone changed hands 6 times. On Little Round Top, the 20th Maine Regiment, under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, stood at the very end of the Union line, the last barrier between the Confederates and victory. Outnumbered and outflanked, Chamberlain's men fought to the last bullet. When their ammunition ran dry, he gave one final order: a desperate bayonet charge downhill into the advancing enemy. The shock broke the Confederate line. Little Round Top held. The Union flank was saved. In that moment, when the last bullet was spent and only courage remained, the fate of a nation balanced on a single hill, night brought no peace. The fields around Gettysburg were littered with bodies, the wounded calling out across the dark. Both armies prepared for one last decisive day. Lee, certain that the Union center had been weakened, resolved to strike it directly. His subordinates hesitated. They knew what it would mean. But Lee's faith in his men was absolute. "Tell General Pickett," he said, "to prepare for the assault." July 3rd dawned clear and bright. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, more than 150 Confederate guns opened fire. The thunder rolled across the valley, the largest artillery barrage of the war. Union batteries answered, shaking the ground like an earthquake. For nearly 2 hours, the heavens seemed to burn, then silence. Out of the smoke, 13,000 Confederate soldiers began their march across open ground, a mile-wide line of gray advancing toward Cemetery Ridge. Drums beat slow and steady. Union gunners waited. Then the storm began. Shells tore through the ranks. Men fell by the hundreds. Still they came on. General George Pickett rode at the front, his sword flashing in the sun. "For Virginia!" his men shouted. When they reached the Union wall, the survivors clashed in desperate hand-to-hand combat, but the weight of fire was too great. The attack shattered. Those who lived stumbled back across the field they had just crossed, leaving behind 1,000 fallen comrades. Lee watched from a distant ridge, his face pale with disbelief. "It is all my fault," he murmured. "I thought my men were invincible." The charge had been magnificent and tragic. In one blinding moment, the dream of Southern victory died beneath a storm of cannon fire. When the smoke cleared, the ground before Cemetery Ridge was carpeted with the dead, men in gray and blue lying side by side, their lifeblood seeping into the same earth. The Union had held. Gettysburg was over. For 3 days, 50,000 Americans had fallen. Fathers, sons, brothers, friends. The fields that once grew wheat and corn now bore only silence. As Lee's army began its long retreat to Virginia, rain began to fall, washing blood into the creeks, cooling the ground where so many dreams had burned away. Meade did not pursue. His army was spent, his heart heavy, but the victory was real. Lee would never again invade the North. The Confederacy had reached its high water mark and begun its long, slow decline. Across the land, bells rang in northern cities. Yet even in triumph, the Union mourned. Victory had come at a cost almost too great to bear. The Battle of Gettysburg would be remembered not for conquest or glory, but for sacrifice, for the courage of ordinary men who stood when standing seemed impossible. The tide of the war had turned, and with it the destiny of America. In the wake of Gettysburg's thunder, another battle, quieter but no less decisive, was reaching its climax far to the west. Along the muddy banks of the Mississippi River stood the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress city perched high on bluffs that commanded the great river below. Whoever held Vicksburg controlled the lifeline of America. For 2 years, the Union had battered at its gates and failed. Now, in the summer of 1863, Ulysses S. Grant was determined to finish what he had begun. To Lincoln, Vicksburg was the key to victory. "The war can never be won," he said, "until that river runs unvexed to the sea." Grant understood. Unlike other generals, he was not dazzled by glory. He believed in movement, in pressure, in endurance. His Army of the Tennessee, nearly 70,000 men, marched and fought through swamps, forests, and rivers to encircle the city. They built bridges from broken boats, cut supply lines behind enemy lines, and fought 5 battles in 17 days. His men called him Uncle Sam and Old 3 Stars. To them, he was the man who never quit. By May, Grant's army had surrounded Vicksburg completely. No food, no reinforcements, no escape. The siege had begun. Sometimes victory doesn't come with a single charge, but with the slow, relentless tightening of a noose. The bombardment started at dawn and lasted for weeks. From the hills above, Confederate guns roared in defiance. Union artillery answered from every side. their shells whistling through the sky like falling stars. Day and night the earth shook with thunder. Inside the city, 20,000 civilians huddled in terror. Families dug caves into the clay hills for shelter. Dark, airless tunnels where they lived by candlelight. Mothers rocked their children to sleep as shells screamed overhead. "We are living like rats," one woman wrote in her diary. Bread was made from ground peas and cornmeal. Mule meat became a delicacy. Yet still, they refused to surrender. The soldiers fared little better. Confederate defenders, gaunt, exhausted, and hungry, clung to their crumbling trenches. Disease spread like wildfire. "We have eaten all our horses," one officer wrote. "We are down to dogs, and soon perhaps each other." Grant's men, too, suffered under the Mississippi sun. But he never relented. When one of his generals suggested a truce, Grant's reply was simple. No, the way to whip an opponent is to keep whipping him. He was learning something deeper than tactics. That war, like history itself, rewards endurance more than brilliance. As June wore on, Vicksburg became a tomb. Every hill was scarred, every tree shattered. Smoke hung low over the river. On July 3rd, Confederate General John C. Pemberton, realizing his situation was hopeless, sent a note to Grant proposing surrender. Grant, stern but not cruel, replied, "Your men have fought bravely, and I will accept nothing less than unconditional surrender." The next morning, July 4th, the white flag rose above Vicksburg. After 47 days under siege, the fortress of the Mississippi had fallen. While the cannons thundered at Gettysburg, the Confederacy was bleeding to death in silence, here on the banks of the Mississippi. When Union troops entered the city, the sight stunned them. Streets were silent, homes shattered, children pale from hunger. The smell of death lingered in the air, but amid the ruin a new hope stirred. For the first time since the war began, the Mississippi River, the great artery of the continent, belonged entirely to the Union. Lincoln received the news on July 7th, 4 days after Gettysburg. He read the telegram in silence, then whispered, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." It was not just a victory. It was the victory, a turning of the war's tide as great as any battle. The Confederacy was now cut in two. The states of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were severed from the rest, their armies stranded, and supplies choked off. The South had lost its western lifeline, and with it, the chance to fight a long war of attrition. Grant, the quiet, mud-stained soldier who had once been dismissed as a drunk and failure, was now the Union's new hero. Lincoln saw in him the same quality that had once saved the nation at Shiloh, the will to fight on, no matter the cost. "Grant fights," he said simply. As the stars and stripes rose above the shattered bluffs of Vicksburg, church bells rang across the north. But there was no joy in the South. For them, July 4th was no longer Independence Day. It was the day their world began to die. And yet, even in defeat, the human spirit endured. Survivors emerged from the caves, blinking in the sunlight. A Confederate soldier wrote home, "We have lost Vicksburg, but we have not lost heart. We will fight on." But deep down he knew, the river that once bound the South together now divided it forever. The Mississippi flowed on, silent and indifferent, carrying with it the echoes of war, drums fading in the distance, smoke rising from the hills. For the men who fought there, and for the nation they tore apart, Vicksburg was more than a victory or a defeat. It was revelation. It proved that courage alone could not defy the tide of inevitability, that no matter how fierce the will, a nation built on division could not stand forever. Gettysburg and Vicksburg, fought hundreds of miles apart yet won in the same week, had changed everything. The South's advance had ended. The North, though bloodied, had found its strength. Two rivers now flowed toward freedom, one of blood, one of water, and together they would carry America toward its rebirth. The summer of 1863 ended not with celebration, but with silence. The thunder of Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg had shaken the world, yet the victory felt hollow. 50,000 men lay dead in Pennsylvania, and another 30,000 starved or surrendered by the Mississippi. The Union had turned the tide, but at a cost almost too great to bear. In the White House, Abraham Lincoln moved through the corridors like a ghost. His face had aged beyond his years, carved with lines of grief and exhaustion. He had led the nation through 2 years of slaughter, yet peace seemed no closer. Letters from the front poured in, letters from mothers, widows, children, each one another reminder of the price he was asking his people to pay. To many, Gettysburg was a victory. To Lincoln, it was something far greater and far more terrible. The war had changed its face. It was no longer about Union alone. It had become a test of the nation's very soul. From the fields of Gettysburg to the steps of the White House, Lincoln began to see the war not as punishment, but as purification. In November 1863, the president received an invitation to a small Pennsylvania town still scarred by battle. The people of Gettysburg were dedicating a new cemetery for the thousands of Union soldiers buried there. The main address, they said, would be delivered by a famous orator, Edward Everett. Lincoln was asked only to give a few appropriate remarks. He accepted. For days he worked in silence, pacing the dimly lit rooms of the executive mansion, drafts scattered across his desk. His aides later said they saw him stare out the window for hours, whispering words to himself, crossing them out, starting again. He did not write for applause. He wrote from memory and from meaning. He sought not to glorify the dead, but to redeem their sacrifice. When he left Washington on November 18th, the weather was gray and bitter. The train wound through the hills toward Gettysburg, passing fields still marked with trenches and graves. Along the way, farmers stood in silence beside the tracks, tipping their hats as the president passed. They knew he carried more than words. He carried the nation's conscience. The next day, November 19th, dawned cold and clear. 15,000 people crowded the new cemetery, their breath rising in the morning air. The smell of fresh earth mingled with the faint, lingering scent of gunpowder. General Meade was there, as were cabinet members, soldiers, widows, and children, all drawn by sorrow and hope. Everett spoke first. His oration lasted 2 hours, a grand classical speech that traced the history of the war in elegant detail. When he finished, the crowd applauded politely. Then Lincoln rose. He adjusted his spectacles, unfolded a small sheet of paper, and began to speak. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, carrying just far enough to reach the edges of the crowd. He spoke for barely 2 minutes. 272 words that would echo for centuries. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The words fell like stones into still water, simple, perfect, eternal. He reminded his listeners that the war was not only about the Union's survival, but about the very idea on which it was founded. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. The crowd stood motionless. Lincoln's voice trembled, but his meaning was clear. The war was not just a fight to preserve government. It was a struggle for the meaning of freedom itself. It is, for us, the living. To be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. And then, the line that would define an age, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. When he finished, there was only silence. No applause, no cheers, just the wind moving through the dry autumn leaves. He stepped down quietly, believing he had failed. But Edward Everett turned to him and said, "Mr. President, you said more in 2 minutes than I did in 2 hours." The crowd would not understand the weight of those words until later, when the speech was printed in newspapers across the country, and the world saw what Lincoln had done. He had turned a battle into a rebirth, and a graveyard into a promise. From the ashes of death, Lincoln gave the war a soul, and the nation a reason to endure it. Across the North, the Gettysburg Address spread like quiet fire. Newspapers reprinted it, school teachers read it aloud, preachers wove it into sermons. It was not a call to vengeance, but to purpose. It reminded Americans that freedom was not inherited. It was earned through sacrifice. Even in the South, where Lincoln's name was cursed, some recognized the power of his words. One Confederate soldier, reading the speech in a captured newspaper, wrote home, "If they believe that, they may yet win." But Lincoln did not see victory. Not yet. He saw only duty and a future still shrouded in blood. As winter closed in, he visited the wounded hospitals in Washington. There, amid the rows of broken men, he moved slowly, speaking softly to each one. He took hands, wrote letters, wept when he thought no one saw. He was no longer simply president. He had become the mourner-in-chief of a nation divided by its own conscience. Still, his resolve hardened. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued months earlier, had begun to take root. Freedmen were now joining the Union Army in growing numbers. The war for Union had become a war for freedom. And freedom, Lincoln now understood, was the Union's greatest weapon. When critics mocked him for freeing slaves only in the South, he answered calmly, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." And when an aide warned that the people might not yet be ready for such a cause, he said simply, "I must do the right as I see it." The war had taught him what the founders had only dreamed, that liberty, without equality, was an unfinished promise. As 1863 drew to a close, the nation stood on the edge of exhaustion, but also on the edge of transformation. The victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg had saved the Union. Lincoln's words had redefined it. The people, weary yet inspired, began to see beyond the smoke, to a vision of a country reborn through suffering. He wrote to a friend that December, "We cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down, in honor or in dishonor." To the latest generation, the cannons had gone silent, but Lincoln's words still thundered, not in battlefields, but in hearts. In the months ahead, his resolve would be tested again and again. New battles would come, new names would darken the lists of the dead. But something had changed forever. The Union no longer fought simply to preserve what had been. It fought to create what must be. Through Lincoln's voice, the Civil War became more than a contest of armies. It became a reckoning, a trial of the American soul. And in that trial, one man's quiet conviction had turned grief into purpose, and purpose into destiny. The war was far from over. But at last, the nation knew why it must be won. Gettysburg had given Lincoln his words. Now those words would give America its future. The guns at Gettysburg had gone silent, but the war for America's soul was only beginning. Across the scarred land, a new kind of army was forming, one born not of conquest, but of conviction. These were men who had once been enslaved, denied even the right to call themselves free. Now at last, they would fight to prove it. In early 1863, following the Emancipation Proclamation, the U.S. government authorized the creation of black regiments. It was a radical act, one that tested both faith and prejudice. Many in the North doubted that black men could fight as soldiers. Some in the South vowed to execute any who tried. But the men who volunteered had waited their entire lives for this chance. Among the first was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, organized in Boston under the command of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a young white officer from a prominent abolitionist family. Shaw was just 25, idealistic and uncertain, but he carried the weight of history on his shoulders. The men who filled his ranks came from across the North: freedmen, laborers, teachers, sons of runaway slaves. They drilled in the cold New England air, their blue uniforms stiff with pride. To them, the musket was more than a weapon. It was proof that they belonged, that the promise of freedom was not just words on paper. They weren't fighting only for a country. They were fighting to be seen as men. Training was harsh. The 54th marched and drilled from dawn to dusk, enduring insults even from fellow Union soldiers. White officers mocked them, Some refused to serve beside them. Even their pay was an insult. $10 a month instead of 13, the wage given to white troops. When the men learned of this injustice, they refused their pay altogether. "We will take no money," Sergeant William Kearny declared, "until we are paid as soldiers, not as servants." Colonel Shaw stood with them, sending letters to Congress demanding equal treatment. It was not granted immediately, but the gesture united his men. They were no longer recruits. They were brothers bound by purpose stronger than any order. By June, the 54th Massachusetts was ready for war. They were sent south to join the Union campaign along the coast of South Carolina, the heartland of slavery itself. When they landed at Port Royal, freed slaves lined the shore, cheering, weeping, blessing them as they marched past. For the first time, black men in blue were seen by those who had once lived in chains, and they marched not as victims, but as liberators. In July 1863, their courage would be tested in the fire of battle. Their target was Fort Wagner, a Confederate stronghold guarding the entrance to Charleston Harbor. The fort sat on a narrow strip of sand, heavily fortified with cannons and earthworks. Every previous assault had failed. But on the night of July 18th, the 54th volunteered to lead the attack. As the sun sank over the Atlantic, Shaw gathered his men. The sound of waves mixed with the distant boom of enemy guns. He looked into the faces of men who had once been property, and saw soldiers ready to die for a nation that did not yet fully accept them. "If this is the sacrifice demanded," he said quietly, "we shall make it." At twilight, the regiment formed ranks. Bayonets gleamed in the fading light. A storm of artillery fire tore the air as they advanced up the beach. Sand and smoke blinded their eyes. Still they came on, shouting, "Forward, 54th! Forward!" They reached the walls and clung to them, clawing for a foothold under a rain of fire. Shaw led from the front, waving his sword, calling for his men to follow. Moments later, a bullet struck him down. Around him, hundreds fell, but the 54th fought on, their battle cries echoing through the smoke. Sergeant Kearny seized the fallen flag and raised it high, shouting, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." Though wounded, he carried it back to Union lines, the first black soldier ever to earn the Medal of Honor. By dawn, the assault had failed. Nearly half the regiment lay dead or wounded. Fort Wagner still stood, but the world had changed. They did not take the fort that night, but they conquered something far greater, the doubt of a nation. News of their bravery spread across the North like wildfire. Newspapers called them heroes. Abolitionists who had once begged for proof of equality now had it written in blood. The 54th Massachusetts had charged into the fire, not for reward, but for dignity, and the nation could no longer look away. Even among hardened soldiers, attitudes began to shift. White regiments that had mocked them now saluted their flag. One Union officer wrote, "No braver men ever lived than those who fell at Wagner. They have made the name of the Negro soldier sacred." The Confederate commander who buried Shaw refused to return his body, saying it would be buried with his black troops as an insult. But to Shaw's parents it was an honor. "We can imagine no holier grave," they wrote, "than that in which he lies among his brave and devoted soldiers." Fort Wagner would fall weeks later, after continued assaults. But by then, its true legacy had already been sealed. The 54th sacrifice opened the floodgates for others to follow. By the end of the war, more than 180,000 black soldiers would serve in the Union Army, 1 in every 8 men who fought for freedom. They built roads, held lines, charged fortifications. Some were captured and executed by Confederates, denied mercy because of their color. Yet they never stopped. They had turned the war's purpose from preservation to redemption, proving that America's future would be forged not just by white hands, but by all who believed in liberty. Lincoln himself was deeply moved. When reports of the 54th's courage reached him, he said quietly, "The valor of these men has sealed the fate of slavery." He knew what it meant, that freedom was no longer a gift to be granted, but a right to be earned. The men of the 54th had marched into history, and in their footsteps a new America began to rise. As 1863 drew to a close, the war entered a new phase. The South still fought fiercely, but its strength was fading. In the North, weary soldiers began to believe that the end, though distant, was finally possible. And at the heart of it all stood Lincoln, transformed by loss, yet guided by faith. The victories of that summer, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and the courage of the 54th had given him a vision of what the nation could become. Not a Union restored to its old form, but a Union reborn, purified through suffering, dedicated to the equality it had long denied. In the months ahead, Lincoln would face new challenges: rebellion in his own party, the relentless grind of war, and the toll of death that never ceased. But he carried with him a single truth: that the fight was no longer just for a flag or a border, but for the meaning of freedom itself. The men of the 54th Massachusetts had shown that meaning in the clearest way possible, through courage, sacrifice, and unbreakable faith. They had proven that liberty was not a matter of color but of conviction. Their charge at Fort Wagner was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new one, the story of a nation learning at last to live up to its own ideals. From the bluffs of Vicksburg to the sands of Fort Wagner, the war had turned, not just in battle but in spirit. The cost was unbearable, the courage unforgettable, and from the blood and fire of 1863, a new America began to be born.